Welcome to this last session of the LMK conference. My name is Hansjörg Herr, and I'm Emeritus Professor at the Berlin School of Economics and Law. And I'm involved in organizing this conference since many years. I have a co-moderator. This is Sebastian Gorchert. He is in the background, and he will also collect your questions, etc. I think we have a very, very important topic this evening: global value chains. There's a debate: will global value chains change because of COVID-19 crisis? What are the effects of the crisis on global value chains? And as you may know, global value chains became dominant in international trade from the 1980s, 1990s on. And actually, traditional trade theory could not contribute too much to the analysis of the global value chains. And here, when you look at the history of this debate, then directly you will find Gary Gereffi. He made clear that when you analyze global value chains, you have to look at governance structures, you have to look at power relationships. And so we're very happy that Gary is the first speaker this evening. He is director of the Global Value Chain Center at the Duke University, is emeritus professor at the Duke University. He has written many, many books, many papers. So I will start to tell you what he has written. And so we are very, very happy that he will join this debate this evening, and he will also be the first speaker. The second speaker is Gale Raj-Reichert. She works at the Science Center Berlin. She also works for a long time in the field of global value chains, and we are also happy that she will contribute to this debate. Last not least, we have Mark Anner, professor at PennState University, and he is part of the Global Labor University, as I am part of the Global Labor University, so we work and teach in that framework. And he also works for a long time in the field of global value chains. He's professor for labor and employment relations, and he actually went to many countries, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, to analyze global value chains. And so I'm also very happy that he joins this debate. He's the director of the Center of Global Workers' Rights, also at the PennState University. And I think what is especially interesting, we have case studies of three areas. Gary will speak about the medical supply chains, value chains. Gale will speak about the electronics industry, and Mark will speak about the bottom of the garment supply chain. So I think we will get a nice picture about different areas. And of course, we are looking forward to learn what changed during this COVID-19 crisis, what may change in future. And I will stop now and will directly give Gary the floor that he can give his presentation, 20 to 25 minutes. If you have questions, raise your hand. On the right-hand side of your screen, you can raise your hand, and then you can directly ask the speakers, or you can write your question. Both is possible, and use the chance to ask questions. But now the floor is Gary.
Thank you for the introduction, Hansjörg, and thanks to FMM for organizing the conference. I'm very glad we have a global value chains panel with the three speakers that, as you mentioned, are going to have very different industry perspectives. So let me get started. So I want to talk about COVID-19 and medical supplies, because this has been one of the topics this past year that everybody has had to deal with in one fashion or another. And I think there's a lot we can learn about industry dynamics by using a global value chain perspective. So what I want to do is, this is a brief agenda of topics I want to cover. I'll introduce the coronavirus pandemic as a dual crisis. It's both a global public health crisis, as we all know, but it's also been a very sharp crisis to the global economy. But one of the issues that has been emerging with COVID-19 from a supply chains perspective are quite severe shortages of key products, including medical supplies, but also including food products and other consumer durables. So I just want to provide a sense of three different kinds of explanations that have been posed for shortages of COVID-19 products, and in particular, I'm focusing on personal protective equipment, PPE. And then I'm going to quickly give an international trade background to the medical supplies industry. And I want to focus on two country case studies. China, which is very important because it supplies over half of the personal protective equipment consumed in the world. And it also was a country that had to deal with COVID-19 very early on in 2020. And then the United States, which is the country that has the largest number of cases. And I think they have two very different approaches to how they managed shortages of PPE that I think helps us understand this final question of, if we're looking at supply chain dynamics, how well did these supply chains work in those two countries? And what are the options for more resilient supply chains? And when I speak about supply chains, in many ways, it's going to be synonymous with global value chains. And I'll sort of refer to the global value chain framework as we go along. So as we think about the coronavirus global pandemic, there's been a big literature on global crises in general of many different sorts, economic crises like recessions, natural disasters like hurricanes and fires and tsunamis, or global health crises like this global pandemic. And I think what's unique in some ways about the global coronavirus pandemic has been both its speed and its scope. On the one hand, it is a global health crisis, as we all know only too well. Over 45 million global cases reported of COVID-19 and 1.2 million deaths worldwide and counting. But it's also been a very sharp economic crisis. And when COVID-19 has hit every national economy, we've had this similar phenomenon of economy-wide shutdowns as countries try to control the spread of the pandemic, which has led to demand spikes as healthcare workers and patients begin to need these medical supplies urgently. But these demand spikes are anywhere from 10 to 100 times what would normally be required of these products. And that has led to these dramatic shortages of medical products. So that's the kind of backdrop to how the twin crisis, both public health and economy, produces supply shortages. A couple maps that we're, again, all too familiar with in the U.S. and other country contexts. So in the United States, as of this morning, we've got over 9 million cases of COVID-19, and they're rising very rapidly, and we have nearly 230,000 deaths. But what's particularly striking now is this is happening in Europe and Asia as well. As we're entering into the fall-winter months, we are getting a new spike of cases that were predicted by the public health folks. And in the United States, unlike Europe, we never really controlled the first spike of cases. So people are talking about this as a third peak, which we can see very easily on this diagram. And the first peak in the spring, April 10th, had the highest number of cases with 31,000 plus. And then there was a slight slowdown. And then as a summer again, we had another higher peak. So by mid-July, we had almost 67,000 cases. And then very dramatically in the last few weeks, we've had yet a third peak in the United States. And just yesterday is the highest number of daily cases reported in the US at over 90,000. So you can see that the three peaks, unfortunately, each subsequent peak is higher than the ones before it in terms of cases, but number of deaths have actually gone down because treatment has improved. So this is the kind of ongoing health problem that we're dealing with COVID-19. So I want to mention, and I think it's important to kind of identify different ways that supply chain shortages have been explained. And I'm going to refer here to three broad approaches. One approach, which I'll call the logistics approach, was talking about the fact that in products like fresh produce, dairy, eggs, the food sector, and even toilet paper, we began to see cases where the supply of these products, especially the food products, fresh produce, far exceeded demand because of the economy-wide shutdowns. And there were very dramatic stories about how farmers were plowing under fresh vegetables or spilling thousands of gallons of milk or breaking thousands of eggs because they couldn't find a market for it. And well-known shortages of toilet paper or paper towels. I think these shortages we can understand largely through a kind of supply chain distribution logic. We've always had two adjacent supply chains for consumer goods. One has been a wholesale chain that's focusing on institutional markets like hospitals, government, restaurants, and the like. And the other has been a retail market like grocery stores, et cetera. So a lot of the mismatch here has been that the wholesale producers of these products have not been able to gear their wholesale supply down to retail markets. So we've had this anomaly of overproduction at the wholesale side, but shortages at the retail side. And I think this has been one kind of phenomenon that's produced shortages of key items like food and consumer goods like toilet paper. More relevant to medical supplies has been what we might call a supply chain structural approach, which is looking at supply chain management and the difference between rigid or optimized or fragile supply chains on the one hand versus resilient or redundant supply chains. And this debate has occurred because a lot of the personal protective equipment, as we'll see in a couple minutes, has come from Asia. Much of the Asian production has been focused in a couple large suppliers, most notably China, but also India or Malaysia, depending on products. And the supply chain model that was in effect for Asia was one of what we might consider cost optimization. Asian countries were chosen because they could produce large scale, low cost, adequate quality for all of the world's markets. But when we hit a crisis like COVID-19, those supply chains became inadequate to deal with the mushrooming demand all around the world. So people are now saying the problem is rigid supply chains versus the need for more resilient supply chains. And we'll talk later what that might mean. And finally, I think a third approach, very important in China's case, but also some other countries as we look forward, is the role of the state. And the idea that governments feed markets in many cases, but especially in a crisis where governments are called into action. And here I think the Chinese situation vis-a-vis face mask is a really instructive case that we'll look at in a second. So I just want us to understand there are three different approaches, and I'm basically going to be focusing on the last two in this presentation. So what would a global value chain analysis of COVID-19 and medical supplies look like? So the research question I want to focus on is how can we explain the contrasting experiences of China and the United States in handling personal protective equipment shortages during COVID-19. The methodology I think we need to apply if we're doing this kind of global value chain or global industry study is we really need to adopt a longitudinal perspective. We have to look at how the medical supply value chain was functioning pre-crisis. Second, what were the specific issues or disruptions that were emerging during the COVID-19 crisis that has led to these kinds of supply shortages, and how have they been dealt with in major countries by governments and private sector actors? And finally, very importantly, what do we learn from this post-crisis? Because whatever ways of handling the COVID-19 supply chain shortages that might emerge now during the crisis aren't necessarily going to be sustainable practices afterwards. So I think we really need to do pre-crisis, during the crisis, and post-crisis to get a good look at this. So I'm going to start with the international trade picture of medical supply products pre-COVID-19. And there's some excellent studies on this by OECD and Chad Bone and others. But this is a good visual, which helps us see that a lot of the so-called COVID-19 goods come from a wide range of countries, but there's one kind of big pattern we can see here. The relatively low-cost commodity personal protective equipment items, most of those come from Asia. That would include the face masks, and we can see that here. So what we have in each of these boxes here are market shares. Face masks mainly come from China. Surgical gloves mainly come from Malaysia. A lot of protective equipment actually comes from Mexico, but some of the other Asian countries. If we were looking at generic pharmaceuticals, India would be a big player. So low-tech PPE items come from Asia, but higher tech items like ventilators, monitoring devices tend to come from the more advanced industrial countries, Germany, Switzerland, US, Singapore, Ireland, et cetera. So we have a kind of two-tier structure for these medical supplies, and I'm going to be focusing mainly in my presentation on the PPE items, the personal protective equipment. And here we can see that much of the world's imports of personal protective equipment comes from China. In general, China supplies a little over half of all PPE items, both to the US and to the EU, as we can see on this diagram. But that's not necessarily true for all products. So when we get to certain products like hospital gloves, China's only got 8% of the market, but the big player is Malaysia, which has a lot of natural rubber and synthetic rubber. And right behind Malaysia, we have Thailand. And if we were to look at different products, we're going to see different countries. So China is definitely preeminent, but it's not the only Asian country that is the key supplier. But as a region, Asia tends to dominate production of a lot of these PPE exports. And the question is why? So China exported more personal protective equipment than the rest of the world combined. And China has two big advantages. One is low cost, but a second big advantage, which is often not that appreciated when we're just looking at trade data, is China's ability to scale up production extremely fast. But the other thing we need to realize is Asia just doesn't have supply side advantages, but there's demand side drivers as well. US manufacturers and hospitals have moved to a just-in-time production model, which focuses on low inventory. So the Asian sourcing situation has been driven by US and European companies, but especially US companies that have gone to a just-in-time production and purchasing model. And then what happened is COVID-19 is, with all countries being affected by it, we also had a set of export controls. 80 countries had export controls. So trade by itself couldn't handle the situation. So let me just turn to face masks. I'm going to focus mainly on face masks. As probably all know, there's two basic types. The N95 are the more sophisticated masks, which block out about 95% of the particles. But the surgical face masks, the blue ones here, are looser fitting and they're more widely used in the entire population. The all of these masks have 3 layers, and before the COVID-19, these were basically commodity items. Even the N95 masks were less than $1 each, and the surgical mask could be produced for a few pennies each. But and from a value chain analysis, this is very critical. Value chain analysis doesn't just look at the final product. We also look at the entire supply chain, in which case there are often critical intermediate products that are linchpins in terms of ability to meet market demand, and that's definitely the case in face masks. There's a critical input, a non-woven polypropylene fabric that's called melt-blown fabric that's widely used in diapers, feminine hygiene projects, disposable wipes, etc., that is the critical material for the filters used in all the face masks, and that's made by specialized companies. So this is just a graphic to show melt-blown is a non-woven fabric. Most of the materials we have in clothes and others are woven with symmetrical patterns. Melt-blown is created by extruding this very, very small fibers in these asymmetric ways, and the fibers themselves are extremely thin, and they also are electrically charged to help them attract the particles and the viruses, and they're also used in construction and many other purposes. So the main point here is to just understand that the key intermediate is a non-woven fabric that is difficult to make, and there is a limited number of companies worldwide that can make it. So I want to turn to the China case to focus on this scale-up issue. So China's surge in coronavirus or COVID-19 cases was January, February, March, and they had their scale-up demand. So in February alone, China increased its surgical mask production 12-fold, from about 10 million to 15 million masks a day. But by March and April, China was already beyond its domestic demand surge, and it was beginning to export a lot of these face masks to other countries. Number of Chinese companies involved were very large, 67,000, and another difficulty here was the mask making machinery. But I just wanted to give some quick statistics on China's scale-up ability. It scaled up its production of the melt-blown, non-woven PPP fabric used for the filters to 150 tons a day in February and March. That's 5 times what China made before the pandemic, 15 times greater than the total output of all U.S. companies. And the U.S. companies are reluctant to make big investments in this same fabric because they're concerned that the mass demand would be only temporary. To me, the question is, how did China do that? And here I think the China economy has very particular characteristics. One, China designated a key interministerial commission, NDRC, to centralize the coordination of PPE supply, taking it away from particular ministries that were doing it before. Second, China was able to turn to its petroleum state-owned enterprises, Sinopec and PetroChina, be able to produce those PPE intermediates. And you can get an example here. Sinopec added 2 lines of melt-blown fabrics in Beijing in early March, which could produce 4 tons of fabric per day, which translates into about 1.2 million N95s or 6 million surgical masks per day. No other country comes close to this scale up, and Europe as a whole doesn't come close. And a final factor here is China not only did it with state-owned companies that produced the upstream component, but they then leaned on a lot of the tech companies that are in China to add face masks to their production lines. So Foxconn, for example, was able to add 2 million masks daily, many of which were used for its own employees. So that's a China case, and it's a very short synopsis of how China ramped up production dramatically in January, February, March, and then began to re-export to the rest of the world. What about the U.S. case? U.S., as we saw earlier, is the biggest source of coronavirus cases. PPE was never a top priority in the U.S. The Trump administration denied the virus itself early, didn't talk about doing social distancing to mid-March. The U.S. equivalent of role of the state was using the Defense Production Act to get companies that could actually produce this. And in the U.S. case, the Trump administration has mainly been focusing on vaccines. Vaccines is the big ticket item. the Defense Production Act was a way in which the U.S. government could require American companies to produce these PPE items, and it was particularly used in ventilators, some more complicated equipment, where the Trump administration turned to auto companies like Ford and GM to get them to produce these ventilators because auto companies manage large supply chains. That was in late March, and in early April, Trump used the same Defense Production Act to get 3M, one of the biggest U.S. producers of N95s, to increase its supply. The problem with this Defense Production Act, and in general, I think it's something we're seeing both in Europe and the U.S., is when the government pushes to have something made from short supply, we can go from shortage to glut quickly. So in the case of ventilators, U.S. scaled up from having only 10,000 ventilators in its strategic reserve to over 95,000 by mid-August. But because treatment of COVID-19 patients meant far fewer had to go into intensive care units where these ventilators were used, now almost all of those ventilators in the U.S. stockpile are going unused. So this is a big problem. If we look at this U.S. private sector response, I would say it was late, but it surged, it was cautious, it was collaborative. So in some ways, the U.S. companies did, I think, ramp up, but much slower than what we saw, let's say, in China. This was the kind of shortfall that was predicted in the U.S. in March 2020. 80 million N95s were produced per month. They were estimating more like 300 million were needed. So my assessment of the U.S. case is policy failures were much more significant than market failures. The U.S. government, federal government, really did not identify COVID-19 supply shortages as quickly as it should have, and it didn't have the tools in its arsenal to be able to get this ramp up to work as effectively as possible. And it didn't have the bureaucratic coordination that China introduced with its interministerial commission. So in many ways, I'd say policy failures more important than market failures. Last slide, the last two slides. How does this quick analysis of China versus US, what does it tell us about resilient supply chains post-crisis? And I think there's a few big issues here which I think are going to constitute a new research agenda. First, I think there are several options to reduce rigidity and build resilience that have been coming out in the literature about supply chains. One is you could make them more domestic. We've been hearing a lot in the US and in Europe and in Japan about reshoring supply chains, that if part of the problem is too much outsourcing and now we have a crisis, you could reshore them and you can build up national stockpiles. Second, you can also make supply chains shorter, and that's mainly through near sourcing or regionalization of production. I think that's occurring in all major regions. In the US, that includes Mexico, Central America, Canada. In Europe, that's including Eastern and Central Europe, and in Asia, similar regional sourcing is taking place. And finally, you can make supply chains more diversified by reducing dependence on one or a couple countries that were key suppliers, as we saw with China and PPE. However, again, those pushes by policymakers, especially in the US case, run into the problem that from a private sector point of view, reshoring PPE is considered not profitable. And unless the government can guarantee long-term contracts, U.S. firms are not likely to want to continue to make PPE domestically. It's really just a crisis response. And so this is maybe my last slide. If we look forward to resilience in the post-COVID-19 era, I think we have several open questions. I mean, no country could have been expected to produce all of the goods needed to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw demands increasing 10 to 100 times. So, and we couldn't rely on the trading system alone because of export controls. So there was a short-term surge for increased domestic production. What does that mean going forward? Well, one, what would a more resilient value chain look like? I think we have to ask resilience for whom? There's resilience for firms, which involves risk management, but that's very different from political goals like we hear in the United States of bringing jobs back home. Second, reshoring does not guarantee resilience or efficiency. In the case of the US and many other countries, the supply chain linkages needed to produce those final products are not in one country. So you can bring goods back home, but you're not going to be able to recreate the entire supply chain. Third, I think we really need to distinguish resilience for firms versus resilience for global value chains. if we're really looking at global industries, those include an international division of labor, and we have to look at government policies and institutions. We can't just take a firm-specific approach. A fourth big issue is going to be innovation, and I think vaccines is going to be a critical question about who controls the R&D, production, and distribution. And a final point, I think the political landscape has definitely changed. Even if we could make economic arguments for continuing to have international production networks, there is going to be a push in many regions of the world for increased security and inward-looking strategies post-COVID-19. So I think we're going to have to try to come up with both business and policy-related solutions that take account of all of these questions. Thank you very much.
Gary, many thanks. Perfect in time. Extremely interesting presentation. We discuss it later. We directly go to Gale.
Okay, thank you, Hansjörg, for inviting me to this panel. It's also really great to be on this panel with Gary and Mark, and also thanks to Gary for setting up some of the sort of basics on the COVID-19 pandemic, which, you know, is really important to understand also what this panel is about. I'm going to focus on the electronics industry, global value chain, and I've titled this presentation as Recovery, Restructuring, and Regionalizing. So the industry is a very large industry, and I'm just going to focus on a couple of large lead firms or brand firms that are based in the US, as well as a couple of large first-tier suppliers or contract manufacturers, again, who originate from the US. And this has, you know, largely to do with research that I've done in the past, and I thought it would be interesting to just focus on a few key players in this industry, see how they've been able to manage the COVID-19 crisis, but also raise a lot of important and, you know, in a way, speculative questions about what's going to happen post-COVID. So I'll just start by putting up a couple of visuals. You know, when we talk about value chains or products that are built in value chains, you often get the, you know, a type of picture to your left, for example, a laptop that has actually hundreds of different components that go into it, which originate from different places, very similar to Gary's picture on the PPE side. Or on the right, you have, you know, sort of a geographical representation of where production takes place across different suppliers of different components. And this is all very important to keep in mind when we think about sort of what would happen to global value chains when they face a disaster, that they're facing currently, but also in the future. Another way to map this out is to really just kind of you know, map out the different key functions of a global value chain, and how over time, and this is the explanation for the rise of global value chains, they've come to include different groups of different types of firms that are involved in making a final product. So I've kind of loosely circled in by color, you know, who are the different types of firms that are involved in global value chains, you know, which in a way apply to a lot of industries. So lead firms or brands are in the business of research and development. They're designing the products. And for some companies such as Apple, you know, they have their own shops, they have their own retail spaces. The blue lines, the blue circle represent, you know, what first-tier suppliers, which includes contract manufacturers, which I'll be focusing on, are in the business of doing in these global value chains, largely manufacturing or primarily manufacturing, but as I will talk about a little bit later on, they've also kind of moved into the space of designing or co-designing with brands or lead firms, and also taking on some of the distribution or logistics services. And finally, we have lower tier suppliers in the green circles, and this represents, you know, like thousands of suppliers in the electronics industry that provide a host of different components, ranging from very high value added components such as semiconductor chips to very low value added parts such as keyboards or cables. So kind of getting a handle of all of this comprises a global value chain. So I wanted to start out as well to, really say, and this will become, resonant later on in the discussion, is that the electronics industry is probably the most globally fragmented. It's widespread globally, and one can see this when you compare it, for example, to the textiles industry. You can read at the bottom of the screen here, the note that says that the circles represent the value added of exports. So for electronics, you can see that there are sort of different regional hubs. If you looked at these circles in terms of quantity or volume, China would be actually massive. That's because 50% of electronics are produced in China. But I wanted to set this out here because when we get into discussing regionalization, it seems to make sense that this might be a possible outcome of strengthening regional value chains as an outcome or a restructuring element of post-COVID global value chain. Okay, so as I said, starting out, I'm going to focus on a few firms, kind of looking through what they've reported in their SEC and their Securities and Exchange Commission filings in terms of how their businesses have been disrupted by the COVID crises. And here I've just, focused on Apple, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and Hewlett-Packard Incorporated. Maybe they're sort of similar, but Apple, is an outlier in many ways. But I think it becomes a bit more clear when juxtapose this to two very large contract manufacturers that originated or based in the U.S., that they are also very large companies. These are multinational companies. They have large revenues, but they employ a lot of people because they are in the business of manufacturing. So they have factories and lots of factories. Both Flex and Jabil have over 100 locations. They're in 30 countries, practically in every continent. And here I've just put up, the square feet of their manufacturing facilities, just to compare it, for example, with HPE and HP Incorporated. And this becomes really important when we think about what is going to be the restructuring of global value chains and their supply chains, which companies like Flex and Jabil will, in some respects, weather most of the restructuring because of their manufacturing exposure. But before I get into discussing the restructuring and the regionalization, I just wanted to say a little bit about the dynamics of this industry. Traditionally, we've thought of lead firms and contract manufacturers in a modular global value chain. This has to do largely because contract manufacturers are highly capable, and, in a way that they can provide manufacturing services for a host of lead firms. So that, the argument has been that there's low dependency across these two companies and power asymmetries are also quite low. But, since the 2008 global financial crisis, so that's sort of the last crisis that led to some restructuring, lead firms heavily consolidated their suppliers and outsourced, actually shifted some of their suppliers to these contract manufacturers and outsourced more of their responsibilities to these contract manufacturers and relied more on them for a whole host of services, not just manufacturing, but also supply chain management and others. And today, one can actually maybe say that some relationships between lead firms and contract manufacturers are more of a partnership. At the same time, contract manufacturers have also revised their business strategies to stay competitive, also as they were getting, more responsibilities from lead firms. And they've increased their capabilities into higher value-added services. So, as I mentioned, they're doing supply chain management, actually, being on the forefront, being able to track real-time data globally of their own supply chains, but also these are supply chains of their lead firms. They're in the business of logistics. They're doing joint design work with some of the brands, prototyping their products, and they're really, advancing in the technological development of manufacturing. So using automation, pioneering in some 3D printing technology and miniaturization. The second point I want to make here, which will carry through in the discussion of restructuring, is that these contract manufacturers have diversified heavily into new industries to stay competitive, really. So they've moved heavily into the automotive industry and the healthcare industry. So when I looked at their SEC reports, Flex reports that Ford Motor Company and Johnson & Johnson were their two largest customers last year. For Jabil, after Apple, Amazon was their largest customer. And there's also been lots of acquisitions. So, for example, Flex has acquired, suppliers in the automotive industry. Jabil last year finished purchasing 14 facilities of the medical devices or the production arm of Johnson & Johnson, a healthcare company. So you might ask, are these contract manufacturers still in the electronics industry? I think, the answer actually is that a lot of products are increasingly using electronics components, and industries such as healthcare, which were, kind of late in the game of outsourcing manufacturing, have been now heavily doing that, kind of following on the path of the electronics industry, which was for the most part, one of the first industries to really outsource manufacturing in a big way. I just wanted to share a couple of photos just to show you kind of who are these contract manufacturers, which is an important player in discussing DVC restructuring. So this is a Jabil factory in Ukraine making automotive home appliances. They're, heavily automated, and you see it's not full automation because there are some people in there, but this is something that they pride themselves in terms of their competitive edge as a first-tier supplier. Here is Flex, kind of showcasing their near real-time ability to track global supply chains, I guess across many monitors in something called a pulse center, which they've already kind of mentioned as being a growth opportunity in the recovery phase as lead firms, as brands need these sorts of services and this expertise to gain visibility in their supply chains in order to manage manage future disruptions. Okay, so I'll get into now, a couple of slides on what has been the impact from COVID-19 on lead firms versus contract manufacturers. This is kind of the same story for different sectors. It started as a supply side constraint with factory closures in China. And this is was a major disruption because China is the largest producing location in the industry, and companies like Jabil had massive facilities there, and which they had to really keep idle and shut down. And so component shortages also occurred among suppliers that were attached in these supply chains that ended up in these final assembly factories of Jabil and Flex, which led then to shortages in final products. This is across other suppliers as well. So we saw, for example, iPhone shortages worldwide. So supply side constraints were met very quickly with demand side constraints as countries went into lockdown, workplaces closed, and HP, for example, faced a fall in sales of their office computing products because offices were closed. But both of these, this industry also was able to partially offset these falls in sales by selling more products that were used for home offices and for homeschooling. So, for example, Apple's sales of iPads and Macs actually were higher during the first couple of quarters of this year in comparison to last year of the same time. And HPE, which is in the business of doing servers and cloud data storage services, were also experienced higher sales on this end in this business segment, as more people were working online, etc. For contract manufacturers, it was a slightly different story because they're not selling final products, but they are selling products to these lead firms. But the main crux was, they're kind of over-dependent, or maybe I shouldn't say over-dependence, but their large presence in China, and which really had a massive impact in terms of the cost side for these contract manufacturers. So, just having a couple of phone calls with these suppliers, became clear that having idle labor and underutilized factories were very costly. The pandemic cost for Gale, for example, in its entirety has been reported to be $170 million US dollars. And some of the cost was also, Gary also mentioned this in the case of Foxconn, was producing the personal protective equipment for their workers. So they produced the masks for their own workers. Gale also had to test workers, measure the temperatures of workers as they walked into factories. And they also had to redesign their production lines to meet social distancing requirements. So there was a major cost side to contract manufacturers due to their operations. And for both of them, there were recoveries or partial offsets through sales in the healthcare industry. This certainly was a boon for Gale, who is very heavily involved in the healthcare industry. For Flex, there were lots of losses because they're producing a lot for the automotive sector. And so when, car companies shut down earlier this year in Europe and in the US, they really felt a loss in revenues in that business stream. So, okay, so just kind of setting all of that aside and to think, keeping that in focus in terms of what this industry looks like. I'm just going to talk about recovery and resilience and restructuring, but really posing more questions because we don't really know what's going to happen. Recovery maybe is the easier part of the story because this is a near-term discussion. We've seen, all of these firms largely recover, mainly because China recovered. To some extent, it's been as a result of China, coming back into normal operations by mid-year. But the recovery also meant that a change in the product mix of what was being sold was really important. Doing more online sales was important for lead firms, for brand firms. For contract manufacturers, having been diversified clearly helped, especially in the healthcare sector. When we think about resilience, Gary also mentioned this, one of the biggest questions that's going to be asked, which is largely the logic behind global value chains, is whether just-in-time production is going to continue to be viable for all supply chains, for all product lines. Having unsubstitutable or unique parts can break an entire supply chain down. And that means that global value chain is not resilient for future disruptions. So will there be a shift towards, what people now say just-in-case production, or for certain parts, for certain critical components, for certain final products that are very lucrative for a company? And part of this resilience discussion is about building redundancy. This is another sort of buzzword now. And redundancy would mean, having several suppliers doing similar things, or which can trade off if there is a blockage with one supplier. And this also means having redundancy of production location. So the next question becomes, which suppliers in this massive value chain for electronics products, which parts and which locations? And this, enters into the discussions around regionalization, which I'll get to in the next couple of slides. But before I do that, what's going to be important is to think through the cost calculations of these changes. It will be costly. And it will be costly for different reasons for lead firms versus contract manufacturers, which I think is really important to keep in mind. So for lead firms, possibly having higher prices would be needed for building in that resilience or that redundancy. higher prices either for products or even for suppliers. And then the question is, will that price be transferred on to consumers, which I'll talk about in the next slide, which raises another set of complex questions in terms of, consumer income recovery post-COVID-19. The cost calculations for contract manufacturers is going to be likely falling in terms of the minimization of labor costs. So Gale, for example, already has announced a 2020 restructuring plan to reduce their headcount, including in China. In the press, it has been reported that Gale will cut 1,500 workers, and that this will go into saving around $50 million in costs. So I want to come to the discussion of regionalization, because that is going to be would be part of the strategies of building in redundancy. And if you remember back now to that third slide with the, complex networked picture of the electronics industry versus the textiles industry, one can already sort of conceive that there are already regional value chains in place. They just vary in terms of how strong they are, or how well developed they are, or how extensive they are. And again, here, how regional value chains will develop is going to depend on the supply side question and the demand side question. And the supply side question, I think maybe will boil down to how to deal with the overdependence on China, at least for the electronics industry and firms like Jabil and Flex, who have a very large presence in China. And the big elephant in the room is, of course, the geopolitics. And Gary has brought some of this up as well. But the U.S.-China trade war has really had an impact on this industry, and is certainly a push factor for American firms. These tariffs have actually hit the technology disproportionately in the U.S. By some estimates, it's affected over $50 billion worth of goods that are attached to the electronics industry or the technology industry. There's also the U.S. Huawei ban, which has impacted, at least for Flex, which had Huawei as one of its largest customers, has led to Flex changing its strategy. So it had to let Huawei go as a customer due to falling demand, but it also led to Flex actually shifting its business engagement in what they've termed to be volatile products in China, and have started steadily moving out of China as a result of that. And all of these push factors, from what's going on with the U.S. government, comes on the back, really, of shifts out of China that's been occurring over the past decade, slowly due to rising wages and other costs. And I think this was mentioned in the earlier panel today on China. There is also a pull factor of COVID-19 related industrial policies of governments trying to lure their companies out of China, and even to nearshore. So, for example, Japan has put aside $2 billion for its firms to either reshore or nearshore in the region, and this gets into this discussion of industrial sovereignty that became, quite salient. Also, as Gary mentioned in the PPE and medical equipment discussions on, domestic security and strategic industries for domestic industries. For strategic industries to be manufactured domestically. And this raises a question then to where do these shifts occur? Which are the, neighboring locations? And if I just pick on the Asia Pacific region, which would be, the likely winners? And if I had a little bit more time, I would speak a bit more about Vietnam, which is a very interesting location. in the Asia-Pacific region, whose electronics industry has grown immensely in the last 10 years and has benefited from a lot of this shifting out of China. There's a lot of linkages between Vietnam and suppliers also in China. But when I had a conversation, with the contract manufacturers about the question of pulling out of China, it is a difficult one for contract manufacturers who have massive facilities there and over many years have built very strong supplier linkages in the country. China has that advantage of scale and very good infrastructure and now increasingly the domestic market. So I think, this complete shift out of China is not going to probably happen in the way it might be reported in some instances, and China will still remain as a hub maybe for the domestic market or the regional market, which is now what I want to move to and hopefully come to an end in a couple of minutes, which is to talk and think about the demand side of these dynamics. So the regionalization discussion and question, regional value chains will be linked regional end markets. This will largely be determined by lead from sales, as well as the future of, the purchasing power of consumers, which will depend on economic recovery in different countries and different regions. So maybe just, as kind of a way to sort of set a baseline of what this means, I've just put up electronic sales from 2019. This might or might not change very much after the COVID recovery, but to just think through where might be the priorities of strengthening regional value chains. It could be interesting to look at where electronic sales are occurring. So for the overall industry, when you look at it per country, ranked from 1 to 3, the largest sales have occurred in the US, followed by China, and then Japan. By region, the top region where electronics are sold is in Asia Pacific, 50% of that in China. That's followed by Europe and North America. HPE has reported on this on their earnings reports, and their largest sales are in the Americas, with over 10% sold of their revenues made in the US, followed by Europe and Asia Pacific. Apple iPhones, again, the largest market is the Americas, followed by Europe. And the third is Greater China, not even the region, but Greater China. And Apple growth in sales. So Apple also reports out on where there is a growing trend of sales, and the two regions are Americas and Asia Pacific, excluding China. So I think this might give an indication of, the Asia Pacific region being quite important for the future. Again, more data would be needed for this. And I've just put up, because Flex has also reported out on this, sort of where their sales are going, and it largely coincides with their customer sales. And just to close, I haven't heard Hansjörg give me the bell, but I'm assuming that I'm getting to the end of my time. I just wanted to close by, thank you. I'll just close by discussing kind of the wider implications of what regionalization might mean. So I'm focusing here on the cost of regionalizing value chains, which will likely be borne more by contract manufacturers. They either have to shift or build up new facilities, bring perhaps their suppliers with them, or try to get suppliers to, or work with suppliers that are existing in particular locations, which will mean that there would have to be some sort of cost cutting occurring at the same time. And we've already seen that that's occurring through reducing headcounts. Perhaps some worker-intensive production will move to lower wage locations. There might be increased automation, as you saw that picture of the Jabil factory. Companies like Jabil and Flex are in the forefront of automation, and perhaps this might push them to do that a little bit more, also to have a competitive edge against other first-tier suppliers. And from a more developmental perspective, it's important to also think through the fact that regional value chains will be unequal. In development, because they have unequal factors. The availability, quality of suppliers will differ. Infrastructure quality will be different in different places. Skill sets of workers will be different as well. You know, even if you have an automated factory, you still need particular skill sets in place to run those machines, to look at the computer software programs to run those machines. You know, and early on, there's already been discussion of how developing countries in the global south will recover, and whether there actually will be winners or losers in these outcomes, I think, are interesting questions to think through for more research. So I'll just end by raising a couple of questions around, you know, the fact that regional value chains will always have hubs, and they will have spokes, and these will determine sort of the winners and losers, the power asymmetries within these global value chains. And maybe I'll just leave it by saying, for at least the Asia-Pacific region, because it might be difficult for suppliers to completely leave China, also considering that the Asia-Pacific region is a growing consumer market, might there be two hubs in the Asia-Pacific region? Might there be a Vietnam emerging as a second hub or in replacement? And the same questions can be asked for Europe and a couple of countries there, Poland or Hungary, where there's a lot of electronics manufacturing already occurring, and for the Americas, it might likely be Mexico. So I'll leave it at that, and I thank you for your attention.
Gale, many thanks for your presentation, and you're almost in time, so it's fine. Yeah, so thank you, and we directly go to Mark.
Great, thank you, Hansjörg. It's great to be on this panel. It's great to be on following Gary and Gale. Gary's work, I know, has just inspired me for many years, so you'll see that influence. I'm gonna also share my screen if I can do this right. So I'm going to talk about the garment global supply chain, global value chain. I'm going to, it follows, I think, some of the structure of the other presentations. I'm going to break mine into 4 parts. I want to talk about what I'm calling the pre-COVID garment global value chain squeeze, the causes and the consequences of that squeeze. Partly to say there were fundamental problems in the garment global value chains before the crisis hit, and explain that a bit. It helps understand what happened when the crisis hit. Then I'm going to talk about the first part of the crisis, the March 2020 buyer response to COVID and the lockdowns, which are these abrupt order cancellations. Third, I want to talk about the current situations, which is sort of the orders now and going forward, and a continued squeeze on prices and this impact of uncertainty. And lastly, I'm going to talk about some ideas of what I see happening, sort of 2 different paths, a more optimistic path or a more pessimistic path, but how public and social governance might help us to build more sustainable garment global value chains of the future. So this is my framework for the sort of understanding what I call, again, the pre-COVID garment global value chain squeeze. I see a lot starting at the top, sort of the macro level, government policies, trade rules, financial deregulation, development policies, the push for many poor developing countries to all get into garment exports, dynamics in those countries and their labor markets. And I see 2 outcomes of that at the buyer and at the supplier level. And buyers in garments, I'm referring to brands like Nike or retailers like Walmart. And I see consolidation on their side and their ability to have greater mobility in their purchasing. And on the supplier side, I see a dramatic growth and dispersion of the supplier base. And what I argue is that gives buyers tremendous leverage over suppliers over time. Then suggest that buyer leverage over suppliers manifests itself in several ways. A price squeeze, what these buyers pay per unit of garment, and other sourcing squeezes, lead times, payment practices, and so on. The combination of those factors has impacts on labor and the environment and on social policy. So labor, I have it here in purple, a squeeze on wages, a squeeze on work intensity, a squeeze on building safety. You can think of Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, a squeeze on worker rights. FOA stands for Freedom of Association. But also there's a squeeze on the environment, and again, as I mentioned, taxes and social protection. I think a lot of us have a graph that we kind of, think about a lot, and there's one that's been on my mind for a long time. I've tried to put the pieces together for this graph. This graph is showing us the real dollar price per square meter of imported apparel to the U.S. market. So what is being paid? When you bring in all those garments, what's being paid? And it's just a very simple exercise in trade data. I take the dollar amount, and I take the volume, square meter, and I divide. So we see this stability in the 90s, even a tiny bit of an uptick. We see this dramatic decline late 90s into through the first decade of the 2000s. We see this kind of bizarre spike, and then we see the decline happening again. So what's going on here? What's the picture behind this graph? And these are the pieces I put together. Here we have a phase out of the multi-fiber arrangement. This allowed for the tremendous liberalization, if you will, of trade in garment assembly production. While that is happening over a 10-year period, China enters the WTO. At that time, I should add, I was living in Latin America, and you heard in negotiations almost immediately buyers telling suppliers, you're going to have to make this product at a lower price point, otherwise we'll move production to China. So it impacted. Whether that move was real or not, just a threat or not, is unclear, but it came up immediately and exacerbated again with Vietnam entering the WTO. Just again, think of the balance between buyers and suppliers and this dramatic increase in the supplier base over time. This spike, it turns out, is a spike in cotton prices. It actually is a 1-year lag. It shows up in fabric and garment prices, but there was a spike. It had to do something with the Indian market, but then a continued decline. Interestingly, during this period, and this is another puzzle that I've been struggling with, we see a shift from the 80s and 90s, early 90s, from simple assembly, cut, make, trim, to full package production. So this push down in price is happening during a period of what we could call, or Gary colleagues would call, economic upgrading. So to me, this is a puzzle that I've worked to understand, and part of it is what I explained above, some of those macro dynamics. This is more the micro level of what's going on in the company, increasing its capabilities, but at a time when macro level trade policy and so on are allowing for the continued push down in prices. This is one graph I did some years ago with some colleagues. It's an earlier version of that pricing squeeze, as I call it, the dark line, and worker rights going down as well. We see the impact in wages. These are major garment exporting countries. Not one of these countries over a 10-year period do prevailing wages cover 50% of living wages. This is a photo I took visiting a factory. It caught my attention. The price tag were on the trousers, and it turns out the price tag was about $68, and that's what her wages were at the time per month. We see this also the squeeze on affecting work intensity. So if you squeeze down on price, right, you're told make this shirt for me for $2.20 rather than $2.30. But other costs are going up. Maybe even the minimum wage goes up. How do you stay in business as a supplier? And the answer is what I argue is work intensity, the use of hourly production targets. And this is from surveys I did in India. We see production targets, women being told they needed to do 60 operations per hour, then 80, and then up to 100 operations per hour. And we see linked to that a rise in verbal abuse. So in that survey that I did in India, 64% of workers said they were yelled at, and it was most often for not meeting those production targets. So again, that squeeze, that ripple down, as some say, the supply chain, and the focus of my research has been on the workers at the bottom. So that's just by way of background. So what happens now when we get to the COVID crisis? Well, we know in March, we had these lockdowns in Europe and an extent in the U.S., the response of the buyers, again, we're talking about brands and retailers in the garment sector, was to abruptly cancel orders. So they tell a factory, make 100,000 shirts for me, and I'll pay you, let's say, $250 a shirt. You make the shirts, I'll pay you $250,000. The shirts, the fabric is purchased, the fabric is cut, the shirts are sewn together, in some cases packaged and ready to go, and then the buyer says, we're not going to pay you, we don't want the shirts anymore. And they argued this was force majeure, act of God. It didn't obligate them to pay up on their liabilities. So we did some research on that. We got access to some data in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, just in that period of March, early April, really March alone, $3.1 billion in orders were canceled in Bangladesh, and we estimated from that about 40 billion were canceled abruptly globally. And in one of the versions of the reports we did, we actually tracked this out by company. These numbers here are just for Bangladesh. This is in millions of dollars. So a company like CNA abruptly canceled $166 million in orders with Bangladesh. So we did a survey following those cancellations, and we wanted to sort of dig deeper into what was going on. We first asked, did the buyers pay for the raw materials, the fabric mainly? 72% said no. We asked after the cancellations, did the buyers pay for production costs? This is the actual assembly. These are the workers' wages, basically. 91% wouldn't pay for production cost. We asked after the cancellations, did the buyers help with furlough pay? So if you're temporarily laid off and sent home, in this case, 98%, the answer was no, they didn't help with furlough pay. We asked about severance pay, permanently fired, 97% did not help with severance. We asked about then the impact on workers, and this was a question to the factory owners, to the suppliers. As a result of these cancellations, were you able to pay furlough pay when you sent workers home? And the factories themselves answered, over 72% of the cases, no, we sent the workers home without furlough pay. So the few that did, they did it out of their own resources. It wasn't because they had money from the buyers. And in the case of severance for permanently dismissed workers, 80% said they were sent home with no money. And we estimate in the case of Bangladesh, you have about 4 million garment workers. At least 1 million were adversely affected by this. And these are overwhelmingly young women, many of them migrants from the countryside into the cities, Dhaka and other areas. This sparked a campaign. It was actually literally called #PayUp campaign. And there was a lot of pressure put on these big brands and companies to pay up, as the campaign slogan said. So of the 40 billion that were canceled now, this is currently, we've been tracking this ever since late March, early April, $22 billion has been paid up. So the majority has been paid up, and it took a lot of work, a lot of phone calls, a lot of report writing, so on. So that was the impact, from the campaigning for those cancellations back in March and April. So what's the current situation with those? So you get these companies now, they get the canceled orders, then they have the pay up campaign. Now they're sort of doing old orders and getting those shipped off. What I wanted to know, and this was my most recent research, is, okay, what's going on right now with orders? What do current orders look like going forward? And these are some of the things I found. So the survey was conducted over this past summer, June, July, August. And the question was, compared to last summer, the summer of 2019, what does your order volume look like? And I'm going to highlight this. You could see 19% said it's very low, less than 25% order volume. 33% say low, between 25 and 50%. So right away, you've got over 50% having less than half their factory operational. And then you can see going on Only 1% has high orders and more. I guarantee you that's because they were doing personal protective equipment. What really got my attention, there's so much you could say about lower order volume now. There's just not the demand for it. So it makes sense that brands and retailers are placing orders that are a smaller volume relative to the same time last year. What really caught my attention and really concerns me, it concerns the factory owners and it concerns their workers, is they're squeezing down on price at the same time. So not only are they going in and saying, okay, last year, this time we asked you to make 100,000 shirts for us. This year we only need 50,000. And guess what? The price point is going, last year we gave you $3.13. This year we'll give you $2.73, which is a 13% decline. The survey, it showed up interestingly when I asked the question, and these were buyers globally in many different countries, Asia, Latin America, Africa. It showed up 12%. I then just looked at trade data for the U.S. and I compared the price per unit in July 2019 to the price per unit in July 2020, and there's a 13%. So it's right in that area, 12 to 13%. If you think back to that first chart I put up, that it was a 30-year graph, the figure for the U.S., and this is all apparel coming in per unit, it's a 67% decline. It comes out to about a year-on-year decline of 2.3% per year. So that's the average sort of push down on prices. From last year to this year, we're looking at something very different. This isn't just normal annual discounting on price. We're looking at a price squeeze downward 6 times the average amount. And I'll explain a bit why we're seeing that. As you can imagine, it's a question of what I would call a crisis of overcapacity that brands and retailers are able to leverage. The other aspects, I focus a lot on price, but the other aspect that's coming out, and when you talk, I've done tons of interviews with suppliers as well as the surveys, and this is from the survey data that I just completed. The other aspect of sourcing, what I call the other aspects of squeezing and purchasing practice, are payment terms. So someone says make 100,000 shirts. You've got to source the fabric, cut the fabric, sew it together, package it, and get it to the dock. And it crosses the bow of the boat. And usually at that point, the buyer or the retailer owns the goods. It's shipped on their behalf. The question then is from the point the buyer, the brand or the retailer, takes ownership of the goods that were produced for them, how long is it until they pay what they owe? And the norm in the industry a year ago was in blue. And you see the highest part is 30 days out. That was the norm. You look back June to 2019. Then you had some 45 days out, 60 days out. What's happening, in addition to the push down on order volume, the squeeze down on price, is a delay in payments. And if you average it out, you can see the orange bar. This is where the current payment terms are. You see a dramatic drop of those paying 30 days out, drop in those paying 45 days out. But those paying 60 days out, 90 days out, 120 days. So a factory in Bangladesh with several hundred workers makes the order and ships it to Nike or Gap or Walmart. They get the order, they have it, and they're waiting 100 days before they pay for that order. The average was 43 days a year ago. It's now up to 77 days out in payment. Given all this combined, the question was, if these current purchasing practices continue, squeeze on price, drop in order volume, delay in payments, how likely is it that you'll go out of business? And this is what caught my attention. Somewhat likely 32%, extremely likely 25%. And the break point seemed to be around 3 months out. Again, over half saying it's either extremely or somewhat likely that they'll go out of business. Getting back to the question, what this all means for workers, we see reductions in working time as very significant for many factories. So the factories open, you're not going to see a decline in number of workers. So it's a bit a hidden impact of this, but they're actually working far fewer hours, which means a drop, of course, in income from already very low wages. In terms of dismissals, we asked this question, how is your employment level from January, before the pandemic really hit the supply chains, to June, 62% said they decreased, no change, and an increase. Again, think of the personal protective equipment employment increasing, but it was a 10% decrease in employment. I'm going to say more about that in a second. So really dramatic impact. I see this as two waves to the crisis. Those abrupt order cancellations in March, the struggle to sort of rectify that, the pay-up campaign, the reinstatement of those orders, but now the second crisis, which is the dramatic drop in order volume, price squeeze, payment time squeeze. So what's the future of global value chains in the garment sector? Well, if we take a pessimistic view of the future, this is what we might anticipate. Buyers consolidate. And here we're talking about the Amazons, Walmarts, and so on, the ones that stayed open during the pandemic. And they gain market share, or I would also say they gain control over access to the market. So the number of brands that actually have to sell their products through Amazon's platform, for example, and Amazon taking its share of that and influencing the price point. So they would consolidate while others would go into bankruptcy. We see this in JCPenney, Sears. There's over a dozen companies now that have entered into bankruptcy process. Meanwhile, as we have this buyer consolidation, consumer demand stays flat. And the result will be increased competition among suppliers for a limited number of orders. That will give the buyers even greater leverage to squeeze down on price. It'll just take that pre-existing crisis of overcapacity to a whole nother level. And of course, again, the pessimistic view, workers will face the greatest consequences of this, as mentioned, a continued loss of hours of work, a loss of job stability. And of course, the last point is just loss of jobs, but I want to emphasize the loss of hours and the loss of job stability. What we're seeing in countries like Bangladesh are workers that had permanent contracts being dismissed and then being rehired on short-term contracts. Again, so their shift, which is a big shift for them, they could be dismissed at any time, is an important shift, but it's not showing up in employment figures. But we do see job loss as well. And then finally, state public resources, again, thinking of a country like Bangladesh or India, remain squeezed. And of course, there's going to be less tax revenue because of a drop in economic activity as order volume declines. But keep in mind, this was already a sector that was built on many different forms of tax exemptions. The whole model was originally established on these export tax-free zones where garments were exported from. So it meant there was very little tax revenue for the state, which meant there was less resources for social protection, and workers are feeling the consequences of it now. I mean, forget about topping up unemployment insurance in the U.S. for a period of time, $600 more per week. None of these countries had the resources to do anything near that. You might have gotten, for a period of time, 65% replacement of a wage that was already $100 a month or so. So a very dramatic squeeze on social protection. And just to emphasize this, I'm sort of triangulating. I looked at trade data, I had the survey data. Here's the view of one brand CEO on the future. This is from Carter's. They make the Oshkosh brand. And this is from on their public filing when they were reporting on their results. And he says, the CEO, the company says, thankfully, given a more favorable environment for input cost and excess manufacturing capacity in Asia, we are forecasting lower price costs for spring 2021. So again, he's saying here very explicitly, there's overcapacity in Asia, and it's going to be that much greater, and that's going to allow us to push down input cost even more. At the same time, our expectations that products cost are lower, right? You're paying suppliers less. We have no plan to lower prices in the spring, so gross margins will expand. Some possible winners in all of this among suppliers. So possibly, again, I'm trying to be optimistic for some segments. Large suppliers in Bangladesh and Vietnam could be winners. How is that possible? One, we've already discussed what's going on with China. Costs have been going up, particularly important in the garment sector, pushing production out from before the crisis. but also because of the tariffs. So orders are leaving China, and there's a lot of orders to pick up for what's leaving China. They're also anticipating, this is why I emphasize the larger suppliers, that the small and medium-sized enterprises in the suppliers, these smaller factories, are getting squeezed out of business. And I could see that in the data. The small and medium-sized ones said they would be squeezed out in 2 months. So the big ones are thinking on both ends they could pick up orders. That's their hope. Other winners might be in this push for greater speed to market, nearshoring countries, Turkey for Europe. I'm not sure. Latin America has been talked about for a while, but it's possible. The problem, of course, this leaves many losers, and this is especially among the 35 million garment workers. I already documented a 10% decline, but the factories themselves are saying if these trends continue, employment cuts could be 35%. So you're talking of over 1/3 of 35 million. You're talking of over 10 million garment workers losing their jobs. So what's the challenge? And I'm going to wrap up here. This is sort of my take on an older theory. I would put it like this. In labor surplus economies, in the absence of strong, binding public governance and social governance, the gains from economic upgrading will accrue to those at the top of garment global value chains, the brands, the retailers, and investors. So the question then becomes, what kind of public and social government mechanisms are needed? And I'll end with this. The public governance, producer governments, and labor laws and enforcement, social protection, industrial policy, tax regimes, consumer country public governance, how they handle the bilateral trade agreements, binding due diligence laws are coming into favor, regulation of the financial market, international level, multilateral trade agreements, development policies, international standards, enforcement of purchasing contracts. I'm going a little quickly because I know I'm tight on time, but my last slide. For social governments, trade union representation is key. In many of these garment exporting countries like Bangladesh and India, we're looking at 2% of garment workers in unions. Industry-wide encompassing collective bargaining, taking wages out of competition, international trade union coordination across countries, right, addressing country-level competition, and transnational binding agreements with labor co-governance, such as the Bangladesh Accord for social governance. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Mark, thank you very much. So please, if you have questions, the audience, raise your hands or write something in the chat. I have a question to Gary and one to Gale. My question to Gary is, which option would you choose in the medical sector? Should we have an active industrial policy? In Europe, industrial policy became sexy again. It became attractive again, and even the German government is supporting a lot of research during the COVID crisis. So my question is, would you support an idea to have a kind of industrial policy to have more regional production in the field of medical supplies, or what kind of policy response would be the best in your opinion? I also ask Gale, and then you can answer. To Gale, I have the question. Listen to your analysis. I have the impression the COVID crisis does not really fundamentally change much. So we have more medium-term, long-term development in the way that first-tier suppliers become stronger in relation to lead firms that take over more functions. So you have a more dual structure with not so much power asymmetry. But when we look at the contract manufacturers, and this would be my question, what kind of dynamic do you see in the electronic sector in for the contract manufacturers. And we had also debate about Vietnam and contact with the research project. When you look at electronics production in Vietnam, wages and working conditions are relatively bad. So Samsung is not really caring much for working conditions. What is your opinion? What kind of dynamic will we have when we look at this third level, so to speak? Do you think there will be improvements, or do you think we have maybe similar developments as in the garment industry? And Mark told us that in the garment industry, situation for the lowest level in global value chain is not very good. Okay, I first give the floor to Gary. Yeah? We cannot hear you.
Sorry. Can maybe
now we can hear you?
Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I think for the U.S. Looking forward, there is going to be more attention to industrial policy. I think it really should be focusing around advanced manufacturing. I think it's a similar debate that's actually occurring in Germany around Industry 4.0. It's occurring in Japan and Korea and even China. As a country that's got a lot of technology, high-skilled workers, and high labor costs, I think the U.S. should be focusing on advanced manufacturing and critical components and value chains. What does that mean in terms of medical supplies? I think it could mean the key intermediate products I talked about. For example, the melt-blown fabric is the critical material for the face masks. I think for pharmaceuticals, there's a lot of discussion about the active ingredients in pharmaceuticals. A lot of pharmaceutical production right now is bulk generic is coming out of India. India is relying on China for the active ingredients. So I think you could decide on certain strategic products, but to do this well, I think the U.S. would need some high-level committee, a government agency, together with representatives of industry and business to try to determine what these strategic products are. China has pushed that very much with its Made in China 2025 plan, and I think other countries are sort of thinking what would be the manufacturing footprint that you would want to expand. So that's one option, strategic production or high-value items. Second, I think, would be near-sourcing. I don't think there's any way that the United States would want to try to guarantee domestic production, products that are essentially commodity items normally. As I mentioned about the masks, they're under normal circumstances extremely cheap. So I think looking to Mexico, looking to Central America, it makes a lot of sense. But I think near sourcing is one of the ways to reduce dependence on Asia, and then strategic diversification. So one hand, some production will come back. It should be critical components and well thought out strategic materials. Two, for the international side of these supply chains, I think more near sourcing makes sense. But the final point is the real future for a lot of countries in this Industry 4.0 era ties a lot to the digital economy. So a lot of production that's going to take place, and this ties into Gale's discussion on electronics, is really the electronics hardware that is tied to the infrastructure, the telecom infrastructure, digital, and the IT company products. So to me, strategic manufacturing in the U.S. case is going to have to focus on a number of these high-tech products that are tied to internet-based companies and the so-called digital economy. So I would move along those three levels, but have high-level planning, the first part, to try to figure out what is strategic for production and for stockpiles in the U.S.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Gale can answer my question.
Sure, yeah. Oh, sorry. Can you see me and hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So two good questions. The first one is, a little bit difficult to answer. So what would happen with the relationship between lead firms and contract manufacturers, and whether there will be a lot of change in this relationship moving forward. I think, one way to think about, the one way that I wanted to first think about this was what happened in the last crisis, the global financial crisis, which isn't comparable at all, but there was restructuring that happened as a result of it. And on both sides, lead firms and contract manufacturers changed their business strategies, but contract manufacturers in a really big way by moving up, into higher value-added functions, diversifying their portfolio. So likely something's going to happen for these contract manufacturers stay competitive. And that question is then becomes what in a post-COVID era. There is some hints of, relying on contract manufacturers a little bit more for supply chain governance. So when we think about building resilience, you need, for example, visibility in the supply chain. You need to be able to sort of track what's going on and intervene, shift production around, pretty much in close to real time, in a real time situation. And at the moment, it's contract manufacturers or these large first year suppliers that have more of this capability of having a better handle of the supply chain in comparison to lead firms who've also outsourced that side of their business or their responsibility down to these contract manufacturers. I mean, I think one thing to always keep in mind is that dealing with building resilience and possible future disruptions is about dealing with risks. And lead firms are in the business of shifting risks down the value chain. When they can do it, it's cost effective for them to do so. So I think, some of this or a lot of this, again, this is speculative, but there will be shifts of the supply chain resilience risk down to suppliers, and contract manufacturers would be, in the position to take on this risk. This then raises costs for contract manufacturers, and I think this is then the next kind of question as to how would they deal with this cost, if it also means shifting production around, creating regional value chains. Would contract manufacturers also become a little bit more powerful in this relationship with lead firms? If lead firms now need to rely on them to manage the supply chain, would contract manufacturers have a bit more bargaining power to ask for higher prices? This has always been a question that I've been interested in because there are not that many contract manufacturers out there that are mega manufacturers or on the forefront of automation or at least advances in manufacturing capabilities. So I think I think we have to wait and see, but I think definitely there will be changes. And contract manufacturers might be in a good position, to use their existing expertise and capabilities to become even stronger from a supply chain management perspective. The second part was on Vietnam, and I do have a little bit more on this in the paper. Also, as you know, we're doing this project on Vietnam, although sadly we weren't able to go there this year. But I think Vietnam is a very important location already in the Asia-Pacific region. Since the last global financial crisis, a lot of production has been shifted out of China and into Vietnam. This includes very large factories of Foxconn and Jabil. And Vietnam is already being used as kind of this tariff hopping location, to kind of bypass the U.S. tariffs on China. Also to the point where it's raised questions by the U.S. administration on Vietnam being used as this sort of sideways pathway to bypass the Chinese tariffs. So I think Vietnam will certainly be a sort of winner. But in terms of their weak infrastructure and supplier capabilities, this will depend on then government intervention to kind of upgrade suppliers. And there's already discussion by sort of the Ministry of Industry about putting policies in place to take advantage of this opening, if you will, which is, this double crisis of COVID pandemic and now the U.S. tariffs on China. I'll just end by saying that, during the first half of this year, while exports were falling for garments in Vietnam, it actually increased for electronics. And I think this gives an indication of the role that Vietnam plays vis-a-vis China in the region. And it would be interesting, as I said, there will be regional production networks that will come up, I would imagine, for the consumers in the Asia Pacific region. But could Vietnam also play a strategic role in its connection back to the U.S. market? This would be interesting too.
Thank you, Gale. We have a question from Andrew. I hope it works. It takes usually a second. And Andrew can ask the question himself. Does this work?
Well, it doesn't seem to work at the moment, so maybe I will read out Andy's question.
Okay.
Actually, he raised basically two. So there's one question that goes out to all three speakers. In general, so what are the options for countries or blocs like the EU to create and maintain redundancy in supply chains for critical products? So this, as Andy says, seems to be inherently difficult. So some simple commodities can be stored in strategic reserves, but this is not practical for many products. Redundancy is something that profit-oriented companies are precisely seeking to minimize, actually, right? So they have little incentive if prices are fundamentally uncertain, and also given that that there's this that governance do have support schemes during a crisis, right? So so can and should governance provide long-term subsidies? And even if they can be designed well, is this also likely to be unpopular with taxpayers maybe? So what do the panelists think of this? So basically that's the gist of the question, I guess. And then Andy also raised the second one to Gary, especially. So Gary just said that how does mention some points on near sourcing. So, and Andy asks, how does near sourcing work in practice? If the distant producer is cheaper, do you subsidize importers to prefer more expensive but nearer producers, or forbid sourcing from distant producers? Yeah, that's
okay. It. Okay, thank you also to Andrew. Should we start with Mark? Do you want to say something to the question?
Sure. Thanks, Hansjörg, and thanks for the question, Andrew. The first question, actually, a little bit more. The nearshoring one is interesting in garments. The first one, garments are fashion sensitive, so this is the problem they're having with inventory. They were in some ways pushed to take up these products that they had canceled, but they missed the production cycle, so now they're storing them. Part of it was even trying to get the suppliers to pay for the storage cost. So there is a role for governments, though. There's a big campaign for wage assurances, international institutions to provide support for social protection for governments that can't do that. So I think that's very important. With nearshoring, because I mentioned it, that who might the winners be? Nearshoring it becomes very interesting in garments because of the fashion sensitivity and the uncertainty. So normally, say for the U.S., Bangladesh is a 30-day shipping time, ocean freight. If you were the owner of a company, would you know how many shirts to order, given every day is different with the COVID and everything? So you're very nervous. You might, instead of saying 100,000 shirts, okay, I'll take 20 now, then another 20, then I'll see how it goes, but get it here really quickly. Because the worst thing you want is too much inventory, which then leads to discounting. Forget about the price squeeze. A lot of these companies lose most of their money because 40% of their inventory wasn't sold at full price, and they have to push it down 30, 40, 50, 60% sales price to sell it and get the product off their shelves. So speed to market is crucial for the entire sector, and even more so in the times of crisis and uncertainty. There's going to be an incentive to have products made closer to the market. Again, would be Turkey for Europe, and Latin America. Honduras is the biggest right now. Mexico has sort of been in decline. It'll be interesting to see if there's some pickup there. Of course, there's the wage component, as was mentioned. It's much cheaper in Bangladesh and India, but it's balanced with the potential, just having too much inventory that you have to massively discount.
Thank you. Then Gary, please, because you have two questions to answer.
Sure. Is my mic on? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Perfect. On the nearshoring question, I would agree with Mark. Speed to market is a facilitator for nearshore sourcing. Another factor is really regional trade agreements. Near sourcing works with countries with whom you have these regional trade agreements, like the North American Free Trade Agreement or the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement or CAFTA or whatever. Same in the European Union with the agreements for trade between countries. So I think the trade agreement is really important to eliminate barriers around between countries. However, it's interesting that in an industry like athletic footwear, Adidas did a big experiment with automation, and it really tried to bring production back to Germany with automated factories, so-called speed factories, and they also set up an automated factory in the United States in Atlanta, thinking that speed to market plus automation would really be a winning strategy, and it turned out to fail. 3 years later, they closed the factories, and the reason was, even for such a relatively simple product like athletic footwear, they couldn't bring together enough parts of the supply chain in Germany or in the US to produce anything more than the simplest shoes that consumers really didn't want. So the end result was they stayed in Asia. Just like with medical supplies, Asia also has the production center for athletic footwear concentrated in China, Vietnam, and Indonesia. So near sourcing still requires you to have a local supply chain footprint, and that's much harder than I think people realize. Nike tried to do the same thing, an automated factory in Mexico for the US, also didn't work, using Flex as its partner. On the question about redundancies, I think it's a good question. Bottom line, I think the just-in-time production business model really wins out over the redundancies argument. I don't think that American firms that are following just-in-time production or just-in-time purchasing are going to want to build redundancies of low-tech products. I think they would prefer to rely on international trade. Stockpiles can help. You can create stockpiles, but the problem with stockpiles is you could misgauge, as happened in ventilators. You could think you need a big stockpile and then later you don't. But also stockpiles have to be managed so that even when you bring products that are essential for a country into a stockpile, you have to be sure that the stockpiles themselves don't deteriorate. So I really think that the subsidies aren't a solution either. So in a sense, I think companies are very reluctant to build redundancies. I think much more they would build complementary capabilities elsewhere. A final point also about stockpiles is technological change is always a big factor. I mentioned how that melt-blown fabric is such an important input for all the masks for medical supplies, but already there's moves afoot to replace that technology of melt-blown with nanofibers. And so another thing that companies think about is they would much prefer to go the innovation route than to stockpile known low-tech commodity. So yeah, I think redundancies isn't, and building stockpiles is not going to work in terms of advanced industrial countries. They're either going to go a technology direction or they will use near sourcing to build up capabilities near their home market.
Thank you. Gale, would you like to add something?
Yeah, sure. I think I also just generally agree. I'll just say maybe a couple of words about the electronics industry. Yeah, I mean, I think there is the discussion around redundancy, but then there's also the discussion around regionalizing value chains or nearshoring, and the latter is already in a way happening. So I mean, it could be likely that gets strengthened. And one example is what happened with the iPhone. So there was a worldwide shortage of iPhones because it's largely produced out of China, and it's very much dependent on that supply chain that's linked to final assembly in China. It could have been different if, for example, there were iPhones built in Eastern Europe for the Western European market. Of course, this would have an impact on prices as well. But it's just these sorts of calculations that I think lead firms will have to in a way decide on. And then the cost of doing that, I think, will have to be passed down to the contract manufacturers and the suppliers that might have to shift or grow or expand in regional supply chains. Again, a lot of this is speculative, and I'm not really sure. When we talk about sort of consumer technology, where government subsidies, at least in the case of the EU, would come into, because there's there aren't really European competitors to like an Apple or HP, and so I would maybe not be able to say much about sort of the role of government in promoting these regional value chains or regional supply chains, but that this would really come out of these firm strategies going forward.
Thank you. There's one more question which comes from a union perspective, and we should not forget this. This conference is funded by a union foundation, Hans-Böckler Foundation, and the question is, what should we think about labor clauses in trade agreements? I mean, this also affects global value chains. I'm a little bit in debate with different unions, and I was very much surprised that, for example, the trade unions in India and in Ghana, I just contact with them, they were very much against trade clauses because they thought this is just a trick to steal us competitiveness. What is your opinion, maybe to all three? What is your opinion? How should we handle this? Is this a good idea to have these labor clauses? And a related question, definitely Gale will know. We have intensive debate in Germany about this supply chain law. That means in Germany and in Europe, there's a debate whether we should have a law that lead firms are responsible for working conditions and decent wages, etc., along the whole supply chain. My question is, what do you think about such regulations, and probably how should you shape, how should they look, these regulations, to become effective, because we have a lot of regulations in this field. They were not binding and they did not really lead to big changes. So it might be interesting for the union audience to have your opinion about these things. Who would like to start? Maybe Mark? Maybe he thought more about that, yeah?
Yeah, the labor clause. Well, you notice, and this builds on Gary's work with his collaborator, Gereffi in Lee 2016. He outlines 6 different forms of governance. So when I was referencing public governance and social governance, so social governance is the labor side. And the argument is, basically, if the market mechanism isn't going to work unless there's a tight labor market, and countries like Bangladesh don't have a tight labor market. So what then does work? And labor unions are one of the key. Labor unions in their capacity to bargain, and as I said, in a company, not just isolated factory with 200 workers at a time, but have industry-wide bargaining. So it's crucial to sort of tipping the balance back in the right direction for workers. Unionization, collective bargaining is absolutely crucial. The question is how you get there. So I think labor clauses can be one component among many. I think the question then is, how are they used? And you certainly don't want them being used for protectionist purposes. And I think what the international labor movement does well is through solidarity among unions. So I think where they work well is local unions working together with international unions, pressuring for modifications and so on. I think you see that a lot of that historically in Central America, for example. But there are other examples now. We know Vietnam now very recently began modifying its labor laws to allow for unions that are independent of the party and the state, and that was the result of pressure coming through the European Union and so on. Sometimes these general systems of preferences also put pressure. So I think I say there's a principle. Strong unionization and collective bargaining is absolutely fundamental to ensuring that workers get a bigger piece of the share of the gains in global value chains. And labor clauses can be one way to get there when used right.
Yeah. Who likes to be next? Gale or Gary?
I can go. I don't have so much to say. I just wanted to maybe point out, because I've heard this from some of the industry folks in the electronics industry, that the USMCA, this is the sort of NAFTA version 2.0, is probably the strongest trade agreement yet now out there, which has labor provisions. And I'm not an expert on that, and so I don't know if Mark can say more about it, but it came, out of labor union trade union politics in the U.S. And I think there is a special way now to think about the role of trade unions in using sort of trade agreements for certain outcomes. And in terms of the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, as you know, Hansjörg, this is part of our project, which we sadly couldn't go and do fieldwork on this summer. But this is exactly what in this project that I'm in, we're trying to understand whether indirectly it has an impact on the ground. And so I think Mark has given a very good example of that in terms of passing laws to strengthen the labor regulations. Might it also have an indirect impact on the way lead firms source from Vietnam? So I think there's lots of questions to be asked. Also on the soft, sort of the soft mechanisms that these trade agreements might have, because the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement doesn't, have room for sanctions. But raising the discussion, might it actually have some impact? And I guess that's kind of a wait and see.
Thank you. Gary, what is your opinion about this? Gary?
Milanovic, and they all seem to, yesterday's session with Stiglitz and Roderick, they were talking about progressive capitalism, and all the panelists seemed to agree that strengthening the role of organized labor is extremely important if you're going to increase worker share of income in sort of more sustainable economy. So I think that the role of labor unions and figuring out how to strengthen them is important. I think that the labor clauses, as the environmental clauses, they're a useful step, but they're by no means the entire answer. So I think for the agreement with Mexico and the U.S., for example, yes, I think it's good to have those kind of clauses for the Mexican side as well as for the U.S. But for me, the bigger issues, I think, are around worker skills and high-tech industries. For me, if the future of manufacturing in the United States is going to focus to a large degree on advanced manufacturing and the kind of electronics manufacturers, for example, that Gale was talking about, then I think worker skills are an absolutely critical part of that equation, and figuring out ways in which workers can perhaps negotiate with companies around skill issues, work pace issues, et cetera, is the new arena for sort of labor renegotiation and trying to increase bargaining power of workers. To me, that's the critical issue. How can workers in high-tech industries, as well as these low-tech industries, increase their leverage vis-a-vis the companies that they're working for? And I think there's probably some new ways that that's taking place, but I think it's a critical issue in order to strengthen worker voice in all of these industries.
Thank you very much, Gary. I think we come to an end. Time is over. Normally, we would now go to have a dinner together in a very nice hotel where the conference usually takes place. Unfortunately, this is not possible. I would like to thank all three for the very nice inputs, important inputs, and also for the debate. And I would like to give the last word to a representative of the IMK, and please say the last words.
Yeah, probably that should be me.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone, also from my side. Yeah, thanks a lot to the three presenters. Also, thanks a lot to Hansjörg for managing this session. In general, as some final words, so we had 3 very long days and very interesting discussions in 9 sessions with 27 great presentations. I think we had a great mix of somehow some big picture sessions like the one that we had last night, and also some very specific and very targeted sessions like, for example, this one. So I think this was a nice mix overall. So thank you very much to all the speakers, to all session chairs, to our never tired support team in the back that I think also had a lot of issues to resolve that hopefully you didn't even recognize as attendees of this conference. In general, also thanks to the Hans-Böckler Foundation for the financial support to this conference. And last but not least, also thanks to all the attendees in this conference for their active engagement in the sessions and also in the very interesting discussions that we had. Well, this was the first time that we had such an online event, and I guess I should also apologize for some technical hiccups that we had and so on. I think this is something that people are still learning, and we had a steep learning curve, I guess, in particular in the beginning. But I guess we also had a lot of fun in the back to resolving these issues, and yeah, it was a great experience for us. Taken together, I guess we had some about 1,500 people watching one or the other session over these 3 days. So I guess it's a big success for us, and also I guess for the presenters to share their work to such a big audience. There will also be a documentation of this whole conference after a while. You can watch the videos later on YouTube if you want to rewind to a certain part of the conference. That should be possible afterwards. So stay tuned for that. Without any further ado, I very much hope that even if we had such a steep learning curve and even if we had a lot of fun with such an online conference, that we can meet in person again next year in Berlin for our usual annual conference. And until that, I hope that you stay healthy and safe, and I hope that we get over this mess during the next 360 some days. So thanks a lot again from my side. I wish you all a good evening, a good night, a nice weekend, and yeah, stay safe. Bye bye.